Most men get one shot at life, one stretch of land to call their own, one place where they can call home. But Erik the Red, he was cast out of his home, not once, but twice. Two different lands, both looked at the same man and said, "You don't belong here." And here's where the fascination with Erik the Red takes root. Most men would break or shrink. Most men would disappear into the cold, fade into a life that no one would remember. But Erik didn't break. He sailed further, started over. He became a legend of the Viking Age. He ended up in a place so harsh, so unforgiving, no one in their right mind would follow. But somehow, against all odds, he was able to get people to move, to settle a new frontier, a place he called Greenland. He left his mark on history, but not just him, his legendary children that would come after. Today, you're not just going to hear about what he did, you're going to feel the man behind the legend, the temper that burned too hot to be contained, the man that refused to bow no matter the cost, the kind of presence that influences others before a single word is spoken. This isn't just a story about punishment or banishment. It's about the power of reinvention. This isn't just about survival, but expanding horizons, doing the impossible and leaving a mark on history. And the story of an inspired life doesn't end with one single special man. It actually founded an entire bloodline, which means the vision for greatness may very well exist in your blood. You just need to unlock it. Erik and his descendants pushed further west than anyone thought possible and refused to stay put when the world told them to, or when the world said it can't be done. Today, you're going to meet a man who refused to be contained by the law, by the land, or by anyone's limited expectations. Here's the twist in Erik's story, something that most people don't want to admit. Comfort is actually the real enemy. The other lesson is that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is also the very thing that sets you free. The first thing Erik ever learned about the world was that it could turn on you without warning. Norway was not in the mood to forgive. Its laws endured. They held and they executed judgment. The mountains, the fjords, and the people all stood resolute against the man who was now considered an outlaw. It all started on a dull gray morning when the damp cold crept into the very fabric of your clothes. They stood at the edge of a narrow strip of ground where grass fought against and lost to the rocks. These were stones piled and stretched to signify a boundary. These stones were the memory of the land and who owned everything on this side of the rocks. Thorvald Asvald's son stood with his boots planted firm on the land he called his. Across from him stood another man, older, worn from years of toil. He had a narrow frame and shoulders that were slightly hunched. The two stood in disagreement over where Thorvald's territory ended. The local farmer claimed that he had been farming this lot, and further on, about 20 meters where there was another pile of rocks. The man pointed out a small stack of rocks sticking out of the grass, just barely visible from where the two stood. Thorvald went from speaking with a direct, firm tone to full-blown, red-faced, spitting anger. "Are you accusing me of being a liar?" The farmer tried to match his volume, but it lacked the same fire when he said it. "This is my land." Had he stopped there, the situation might have turned out differently. History might have turned out differently. But he continued, "You're as dumb as that pile of rocks, and I feel sorry for your children growing up under such a violent temper." Thorvald took a quick step forward and grabbed the man's lapel with both hands and pulled him with a quick jerk, turning and throwing him to the ground. The man had no time to brace for the fall. The rock met his head before he knew what had happened. He lay there still. Thorvald left him where he lay and returned home. Later that evening, a young Erik was tending to his chores when he saw 6 men approach. He ran to tell his father. Thorvald emerged from the house, beard dotted with crumbs and dripping with one last swig of ale. Thorvald stood in confident defiance on the path with his hands on his hips. 3 elders from the local council and 3 boys of the deceased came to inform Thorvald of a gathering that would happen the next morning. One of the elders spoke first, voice steady and practiced. Thorvald Asfaldsson, a gathering will be held at first light. Thorvald's gaze didn't shift. I expected as much. Another elder stepped forward. You will answer for what you have done. The law will be your judge. Then one of the sons broke rank, stepping forward, but was stopped by the 2 elders. You won't walk away from this. We'll make sure of that. Thorvald's look was cold and indifferent. Your father was greedy for my land, and it cost him, he said. That's our land, and after tomorrow, this will be our land too. The elder stopped the conversation from escalating. That's enough. Tomorrow, the law will speak. Thorvald stared with unshakable defiance. I'll be there. The next day, the village had gathered. Not loudly. Barely anyone spoke. That's always the way it was when something final was about to happen. Young Erik stood before his father, half hidden in the shadow of a man who was as thick as an oak tree. Thorvald didn't show signs of being nervous. He did not plead his case. He didn't try to explain himself. He simply stood. Anger, sadness, and worry were seen on the faces of the family of the deceased. So many unknowns now that the patriarch of the family was gone. A man was dead. The assembly and the legal proceedings began and came to a rather quick and direct verdict. The law speaker stood to tell everyone of the final decision. Thorvald's jaw tightened. His eyes didn't search the crowd. He was not looking for sympathy. A voice spoke low, firm, unyielding. Thorvald Asfaldsson, you are now an exile. You are no longer one of us. And so Thorvald and his family were escorted to their home to collect what they could carry. They boarded a Canar ship and they set sail to the island of snow. The sea didn't welcome them, but it hadn't rejected them either. The Canar groaned as it cut through the black water, its hull creaking with every swell. The wind came in sideways, cold and constant, hurling mist and salt that stung the eyes. Every rope was damp, every plank was slick. There was no escaping the damp cold. Even the air felt thick, like the clouds might descend upon them and swallow them whole. Erik sat near the bow, knees pulled in, arms wrapped tight around them. He was cold, but there was a fire growing inside. He learned long ago that tears didn't change anything, and that people respected, even feared the flame. Thorvald stood at the stern, always standing. Erik watched him more than he watched the sea. He studied the way his father held himself, unbending, unapologetic, as if exile wasn't a punishment, but an opportunity to prove the world wrong, as if the land they had just left behind had made a mistake. That night, the waves grew taller and more violent. Erik couldn't sleep. The cold made sure of that. So he climbed to his feet and he moved carefully across the deck, steadying himself against the rail. He made his way towards the stern, towards the only place that seemed anchored in something certain. Thorvald didn't turn when Erik approached. Erik was used to that kind of cold from his father, even though he longed for attention, something he would never get. "Can't we go back?" Erik asked. The words felt small the moment they left his mouth. Thorvald's eyes fixed on the boy like he had just died in battle because he was weak-minded. No. That was it. No explanation, no words of wisdom to follow. Erik said with the faintest flicker of fire in his voice, "That was our home." Thorvald shifted his gaze just enough to look down at the boy. "It was land. Just dirt," he said. "Land can be taken. Land can be lost. And the land doesn't care one way or another." Thorvald turned fully and continued. With no regret, he spoke, "You only have what you are willing to take and what you're strong enough to keep." Erik took it all in, still disappointed about leaving. Now had a new vision that would guide him through similar circumstances just over 2 decades later. Days on the ship passed, or maybe it was weeks. Time blurred when the horizon looked the same day in and day out. Endless gray sky, dark gray water, and an uncertain future. Until one morning, someone shouted, "Land!" It rose out of the mist and water like something untouched, untethered from the world. Erik and his family sensed a fresh start was waiting for them. What they found was more harsh than they expected. A land that was unwelcoming. It was a place where the earth itself seemed to resist being lived on. This was not Norway. No soft valleys, no forgiving soil. This was a land of stone, cold, and wind. They made camp along a narrow stretch of coast where the black rock met the cold water. There were no markers here, no boundaries, hardly any people, which meant there was no one to argue with, and no one to tell them where they could or couldn't stand. Erik's family found a suitable location for a settlement. They staked their claim. They built, they farmed, and they thrived in a place that many would not, or could not. Erik grew up on this homestead in Iceland, and he worked hard. With a land that was unforgiving, a father that was even more stubborn, Erik developed a character that would soon rival his father's. Soon the tension on the farmstead would prove to be too great for Erik and his father. Newly married, Erik took his wife and they settled further south in a beautiful geothermal valley. He set off to start something new, from scratch. This was a chance to prove himself, to not have anyone directing his every move, and to avoid conflict between two hot-headed, passionate men. That is, he and his father. As he journeyed south, he saw from a distance water shooting straight into the sky. He had never seen such a thing. He had only heard rumors of it from travelers who traversed Iceland's interior. From his elevated position, he observed below in the Haukadalur Valley green fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. Much of it was open. Across the open space, there was what seemed like endless trees. And across the fertile, windswept land, Erik could see plumes of steam rising from the earth. This was like nothing he had ever witnessed. And he knew this place was the place where he would settle down and raise a family. This is where it begins. There was only one problem. Erik wasn't the first to discover this rich valley. And it wasn't the land that was going to test Erik. He was going to have to get along with his new neighbors. Before we follow Erik's story any further, we need to understand the highlights of history, the facts, the myths, and what the sagas have to offer in helping us understand this larger-than-life character. Much of what we know about Erik the Red comes not from official records, but from stories passed down and written later. Primary sources are the medieval Icelandic sagas, especially the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Erik the Red. These accounts blend history with storytelling, preserving real events while shaping them into something more memorable. So what we have is not just a record of Erik's life, but a legacy told through the lens of those who remembered him. Erik was born around 950 AD in Norway. He entered during what some might consider the peak of the Viking Age, a world that didn't tolerate weakness, hesitation, or excuses. Erik experienced exile very early. He was roughly 10 years old when his father and family were exiled from Norway and set sail for Iceland. At the time, Iceland had been settled for less than 100 years. His father, Thorvald Asvaldsson, he killed a man. Norway had a justice system that judged him guilty and sentenced him to outlawry, or to banishment. This set the stage very early for Erik to have some sense of adventure, that starting over is possible, which is a good thing because he'd have to do it more than once. Some people grow up in the same place their whole lives, never venture beyond their own borders. But Erik had been forced into a different pattern of crossing the sea, crossing the land, and finding suitable places to start fresh, to start over. Iceland was more than a second chance. It was a new beginning. A hard land for sure, but once you figure out how to tame the wild volcanic island, one could create and carve something new, something special, something that would last, and that's exactly what Erik did. Erik grew strong, capable, the kind of man others noticed without trying. His hair, impossible to ignore, burned red like fire in the sunlight. But it wasn't just the hair. It was the way he carried himself. He had the flame of an elite warrior, muscles forged from relentless work of building a settlement from scratch, harvesting trees, building longhouses, creating pasture and tending the land for crops. He was always moving forward. Most people think that Erik got angry one day when he went on a rampage and killed his neighbor, and that's how he got kicked out of Iceland. But that's not how it started. You see, he had men who lived and worked on his land. He had built a settlement, a community with him as the leader and the landowner. The men were working on a hillside, cutting, moving earth. They were probably cutting out peat for fuel, or they were expanding the land for more pastures, larger fields. Well, the land didn't hold. The rains came and the soil gave way. Loose soil and mud spilled into the neighboring farm, erasing work that had taken years to build. That's where the line was crossed. Not by Erik, not yet. The neighbor didn't come to talk or demand Erik make things right. He came with his version of eye for an eye. With a weapon in hand, he found Erik's servants and killed every last one of them, murdered them on the spot. To Erik, this was not a dispute over boundary lines. This was survival warfare. One situation that could have been deemed an accident, the other was premeditated destruction of economic property. Erik couldn't let this go. He didn't negotiate. He didn't wait for the locals to gather and decide on a resolution. He went to the man that was responsible. He settled the dispute by killing his neighbor and another man who came to his aid. Whether you think Erik was justified in this or not, he had crossed a boundary line that the locals would judge and the law speaker would condemn. The judgment suggests that he may have been somewhat justified, as Erik's banishment from the land only lasted 3 years, unlike the exile from Norway that was indefinite. During the Viking Age, outlawry was not something most people survived, but Erik wasn't like most people. Erik had heard of the land spotted by sailors off to the west. He took all that he had, their stories, and he sailed west. There were no guarantees. He didn't have a map, just a direction and a few clues offered by other seafaring men. Erik the Red arrived in Greenland around 982. He explored the coast for 3 years, mapping the fjords, testing the land, figuring out where the best place for a settlement or settlements would be. When his exile ended, he returned to Iceland on a mission. He gathered the locals, the disenfranchised, and those who were tired of serving rich landowners, and he tells them the stories of Greenland. He paints a picture of opportunity and adventure. With the imagination rooted in this mysterious Greenland, 25 ships fill up and make their journey to a new frontier. The problem was, only 14 survived the treacherous journey. Erik established 2 main settlements. The eastern settlement, which became the strongest and largest, the western settlement further north, smaller because of the harsh conditions. And at the center of it all was Erik himself, the lone ruling chieftain. He wasn't just building something to survive. He built an infrastructure that would last for centuries. Farms were managed, livestock multiplied, and trade routes were established. Walrus ivory became very popular in Western Europe. Meanwhile, his legacy was also growing, and it was about to stretch beyond himself and the shores of Greenland. You see, his son, Leif Erikson, ends up sailing from their settlement in Greenland to North America. Erik had 2 more boys, Thorstein and Thorvald, whose birth order is often debated, but they both also sailed west. Thorvald reached Vinland and explored it, but he was killed there, shot by an arrow during a conflict with the natives. Thorstein attempted to reach Vinland but never made it. Storms drove him back, and he later died of illness in Greenland. Erik's daughter, Freydis, would later sail west herself, earning a reputation as a fierce, fiery, and unpredictable warrior. She left her mark on the sagas. But there may be a reason for her ruthlessness, because the circumstances surrounding her birth were controversial and set her up for unresolved tension her whole life. You definitely want to listen to her episode. Erik's wife was a major part of the settlement in Greenland. At that time, much like the rest of the Viking world, people were converting to Christianity. Erik's wife embraced these new beliefs and converted. But it doesn't end there. She built a church in Greenland, and then the next generation began to shift, including Leif. But Erik, he did not. He remained tied to what the Christians would have called pagan beliefs. But to him, it was what he had always known. There were attempts to convert him, but he was unbending and unapologetic. Then around the year 1003, the end of Erik the Red came quietly. There was no battle, no more exiles. It was an epidemic that spread through the colony. No one knows for sure what the disease was, but what we do know is that it didn't care who Erik the Red was. Erik died in his home there in Greenland. But the settlement, it didn't die with him. His children, those who followed him, and their descendants lasted for centuries. Erik the Red didn't just discover Greenland. He turned exile, punishment, and a sentence placed on him by society into opportunity and expansion. And he built something that outlived him for generations. Let's return back to our saga of Erik the Red and listen for the details the historical facts fail to paint for us. The valley in Iceland, it didn't change him. It gave him room to build, room to prove, room to become something more than a son of an exile. And for a time, it worked. It worked really well. Erik built more than a home. He built a life. He might have even been content to never leave, to raise his family there in the valley, to see his grandkids born and raised, to build a legacy that the world might soon forget if it wasn't for one fateful turn of events. He and his wife were succeeding in every way on their Icelandic homestead. Children came, 4 of them, each one born there on this expanding settlement in Iceland. Each one embodied the strength of Erik from an early age, running about the valley, tending to their chores, and always looking out beyond the horizon, thinking what lies just beyond. Erik walked the land, each night the same way, reflecting on what led him to this point, the cold journey from Norway to Iceland, the peninsula that wasn't big enough for 2 strong personalities, the path further inland, the moment he first laid eyes on the valley. But one morning he woke just like any normal day on the frontier. He gave instructions to his men. "You 3, go to the top of the hill yonder and cut tough for fuel. We'll need to stack it and have plenty to last winter. We don't want a repeat of what happened last year. The rest of you, help clear the lower section where they've already cut. We'll expand our fields next spring. Just don't venture over that set of stones that marks the end of our space." The men set out to accomplish the work for the day. Erik gave his children directions for the chores, and he got to work making repairs on the outside of the longhouse. It had been raining for a few days, and the tuft roof had been leaking in a couple spots. Erik and Leif were working on overlapping sections of tuft to keep the rainwater out. The men worked hard in the rain. The work was deemed successful as they succeeded in stopping one of the leaks. "Well, let's move over and let's fix the other one," Erik said. And just after noon, one of Erik's men came running. "Sir, the hill gave way. It's a terrible mess." "Is everyone okay?" came the reply. "Well, we all managed to move out of the way." "How bad is it?" "Oh, sir, you'll have to come and see." Erik jumped down from the roof. As he passed by the woodpile, he grabbed an axe stuck in the splitting stump. Without thinking, purely instinct, to never leave home without some sort of tool, he tucked it into his leather belt. As they approached, he could see half of the hill was no longer there. Rock, soil, and mud spilled down. He could also tell that from the sheer amount of hillside that was missing, that the landslide had spread beyond his boundary. What the men saw as they got closer were bodies, and the final blow of the last remaining man who served Erik. The neighbor had noticed the men working, and he warned them if they crossed into his area that there would be consequences. When Erik's neighbor saw the destruction and the amount of land that had now affected his property, he was beyond outraged. Erik stood on the edge of the destruction, his men laying face down, murdered by a disgruntled landowner who never liked Erik living close by. When the 2 locked eyes, Erik's neighbor said, "I warned them. They better not cross over this boundary line. Instead, they poured mud and rocks and they ruined my field. I won't be able to plant anything here next spring. It'll take me a year or more to clear this mess, all because of your wicked servants." Erik answered, "The men were just doing their job, making sure we had enough fuel for winter. You think they did this on purpose? I think you told them to sabotage my land." Erik had heard enough, seen enough. Erik pulled out his axe and walked towards the man who had slaughtered his men. With rage and fury in his eyes, Erik lifted his axe above his head and he brought down a thunderous blow. Erik's axe was deflected by his neighbor's murdering tool, a much smaller axe, but nonetheless deadly. Erik shouted and swung again and again and again. Each time it was deflected, but just barely. The strength of Erik was too much for the man and his small weapon to continue to block and withstand the onslaught of revenge. The first blow that landed struck the man's left collarbone. His arm went limp. Still trying to block, Erik's blade glanced the handle sliding down and removing the man's fingers, causing the blade to fall. Unarmed and wounded, Erik struck the final death blow to the man's neck. It was over. That is, until the locals found out. Word spread fast, and the men who tolerated Erik, respected him, even feared him, now saw that something had to be done. The assembly was called. Erik stood before them. He didn't try to hide what happened. He felt he avenged his men properly. Whether it was a motivation for justice, an opportunity to rid the valley of Erik's hot temper, or maybe gain a little extra stretch of developed territory. The law speaker raised his voice to declare what the law says and what the verdict would be. "Erik the Red," he said. "Erik Thorvaldsson," he said. "You have been sentenced to exile. You are not allowed in Iceland for a minimum of 3 years." A pause. Then the words that had followed his family once before. "You are no longer welcome here, and you are no longer protected by the laws of the land." Erik didn't flinch, because somewhere deep inside, he had been here before. It was a memory 2 decades old, but in some way, it felt natural to navigate the situation. He returned home quickly because once the verdict came down, Iceland became a dangerous place for him and his family to remain. Erik's wife, 4 children, and 1 remaining servant gathered everything they could, packed it up, took supplies, knowing that they would be starting over. They needed more than just the essentials in order to make it to where they would end up. They boarded a longship and set sail down the river to the North Atlantic. Once in open waters, they stayed within sight of land as long as they could, and they set course west. The journey was brutal. It took Erik back to that journey from Norway. He had never felt the same relentless cold since that journey, and now everyone on board was experiencing the same bone-chilling temperatures of sailing across open sea. The sky was overcast the whole way. There was no warmth for the sun, and it provided no direction. Leif used Icelandic spar to confirm they were traveling the correct path. If it wasn't for a day with very little wind, the group would have reached land in just 4 days, but it took them 5. Leif and his siblings observed their father's confidence and lack of regret the whole way. Erik stood at the stern with a look of determination, optimism, and steady confidence that said, "He's seen how this goes. He knows how the story ends, or begins." He knew it all works out, even if they didn't know it yet. The land appeared off in the distance. The coastline, it was black at first, and had towering mountains covered in snow. And as they approached, there were flat white islands in the middle of the water. Erik pointed. "It's drift ice." Eventually, color began to paint the landscape. Golden grass and dark rugged rocks with snow dust lining the hills and cliffs. One of the boys said, "It looks harsh." Erik replied with a smile, something he rarely did. "We were made for this. We will build a life for ourselves and for others here." What Erik found was space, enough room for he and his family. No neighbors, no boundaries, no disputes. No one to tell him where he should stand or to tell him he no longer belongs. He felt it. He was home. They ran the boat right up onto the black pebble shore. Erik leapt off the ship onto the beach and instantly saw something that no one else could, a future. They set up camp, and for the next few weeks they walked the coast, measured, considered, mapped out, and chose the best place, not just to settle, but a place that would eventually become a community. When his exile ended, Erik returned to Iceland one more time, not to start over, but to invite others into a world where people would have a fresh start in a place he called Greenland. And that is where his legacy was built, on the edge of the known world. After being told he didn't belong in Norway or Iceland, but the Viking spirit can't be broken easily when there's potential just beyond the horizon. Getting there may not be easy, and may feel like rejection or failure, but the willingness to go is what turns the ordinary into extraordinary. There's something about Erik the Red and his story that resonates with all of us. Not the violence, not the exile, not even the audacity of naming a land of ice green and convincing other people to follow him there. No, it's the movement of the story, the refusal to break or to succumb to the obstacles he faced. Each was a failure, a trial, a rejection, but they all became his opportunity. But here's the reality. Erik isn't better or stronger than you. He only possessed a mind that was willing to entertain possibility and to move in that direction. He never gave up or had a defeated attitude like the world was stacked against him and he was dealt a bad hand, so he might as well give up. He refused to think small. So here's the question I want to leave with you. What about you? What's your mindset? There's a famous quote by Horace Greeley who said, "Go west, young man, go west." And I changed it a little bit to fit our Viking age and our Viking mindset. Sail west, young man. Sail west. Because there's always opportunity waiting. Don't ever lose hope or sight of the possibilities. Just like Erik, sail west. And if this episode meant something to you, if Erik the Red inspires you, share with us in the comments. Share your insights. You may know someone who needs to hear the story of Erik the Red, so share it with them. And make sure you come back, because Erik isn't the only Greenlander that has an episode in the queue. And trust me, you're going to want to hear what his son and his daughter do next. Well, until next time, be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.